How's everybody doing today? Today I just wanted to do a short little video on lists. This video is going to reference 3 different programs, each of which are available to you on the download. The first one I'm working with is called Lists. Now a list is very much like an array. It's like a variable which has multiple placeholders. To define a list, I use the keyword list, and then I specify what type of data it is. My first list that I made was names, so it had to be string since it was text-based data. So list, then I specify the type of data, I specify the name of my list, I get to pick that, equals new list string, and then some parentheses. So that defines my list. Now I can add names to my list. Just like an array, after you create a list, you can add things to it individually, or you can add to it by initializing it. Here I added to it individually. I just added 4 names, and you just reference the name of your list and then use the .add function and you add whatever you want. Here again I've got 4. Now if I wanted to do this with an initialization, what I could do, I'd use the same line of code that I did up here, but instead I would follow it with my brackets and my 4 names in quotes separated by a comma. Either one works fine, so that's kind of the first thing that I wanted to show you. The next thing that's kind of neat is with a list, you don't just have to base it on variable types like, oh, this is a integer, a list of integers, or a list of string data. We can even base it on objects like a text box or a picture. The next program I'm going to reference is called Picture List. Again, this is available to you. And what I did is I created a list, but I based it on an image. Okay, image is an object. When we bring out an image box, it's an image. So I've got list, then the type of data I want, image. I just called this my picture list equals new list image. So pretty much exactly the same way I set up the string list from the project before, but this one is based on an image. Now I already have 4 pictures in my resources, and I have a picture box as well. If I go to my form, I see I've got a picture box here. So that was already done. But if I want to add these 4 pictures to my list, I just do my picture box list, and that's what I called it up here, .add, and then I just have to specify properties, .resources, and then the name of the picture. So you'll see I added 4 different pictures. I have another cool thing I can do now that I've got these things in my list. This is, much like an array. I brought out a timer. Now we haven't talked about timers too much yet, but if you bring one out, it just happens to settle here. It doesn't, no matter where you put it on your form, it's still going to settle down here. So there's 2 properties on a timer that are important. One is enabled. By default, enabled is false. So if you set enabled to true, it means you're starting the timer. Pretty much synonymous with you have a stopwatch, and if you set enabled to true, that means somebody, clicked on the stopwatch and started it. And then there's the interval. I set this at 1500, which is a couple seconds. The lower you set the interval, the faster it will move. So I've got a timer here. I'm going to go back to my code. And what I've done when I load my form, this is my private sub to load my form. This is where I added the pictures, and I also set the timer enabled equals true. So basically when the project comes up, it loads the form, it sets the timer to true, which is on. Once the timer is on, what I want to do is I've got picturebox1.image. Okay, that's just my picture box, equals my picture box list. Now this is my list. Count. Now count is going to be the indice. Okay, which as I go through the timer, every time the timer ticks, which for me is about once every 2 seconds, it executes this code in here. So every time it ticks, it updates my counter, increments my counter. I want to make sure I don't go out of range because I've only got 4 pictures. So if I get above 4 and I try to access my picture list 5, it will create an out of bounds error. So I don't want to do that. So what it'll do is turns the timer on, the timer starts clicking, and it just moves count from 0 to 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 0 to 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. And in essence, what I've done is I've created a little picture viewer. So if you don't want to go out and spend the money for a picture viewer, you can just create one on your own. And it'll just keep scrolling through all these marvelous pictures. So, pretty cool. Anyhow, the last program I wanted to show you is a text box list. So this one is called text box list, and again it's very similar what I did with the pictures. If I go to my form, I see I've just got one button and I have 5 text boxes, and I just happen to name these text box 1, text box 2, 3, 4, and my last one is named text box 5. If I go see what I did with my button, I define my text box list. Again, it's keyword list. The type of list is a text box list, so I use the keyword text box. I just called it my text box list. You can call this whatever you want. Equals new list text box parentheses parentheses. Here I added the 5 text boxes. Okay. Now again, once I get this in, I think, well, I want to kind of play around with it, see what I can do. So I set up a little loop. I define my counter variable for count equals 0 up to count less than or equal to 4. Count increments 1 at a time. I've got my text box list count dot text. Now this is interesting. Since my text box list count does represent a text box, remember, because it is a list and the type is text box, I can actually use the dot text property after this. Now if count equals 0, it's going to reference my first text box. If count equals 1, my second text box, and so on. And again, if count equals 4, it'll actually reference my 5th text box. Each time it goes through, it's just going to take the value of count and copy it into that text box. So pretty simple what it's doing. If I hit my button, there it is. The cool thing is, if I had 100 text boxes, this loop would be the same size. You can start to see how you can really start to work with different objects in a list in conjunction with a loop to do a lot of things very quickly. Our upcoming homework, you have to do a math test, and it's 20 questions, and you have to, in each case, determine if the answer that the user put in was correct. Now, if you were just doing this with 20 different text boxes and you had to check if it was correct, you had to do some error checking, I mean, you probably have to do about 4 or 5 lines of code times 20. That's about 100 lines of code right there. Now, if you do it in a list, you make a text box list and you use a loop, you might be able to get that 100 lines of code down to 10 lines of code. So these are just ways where you can really start to make some economies of scale when it comes to programming. Anyhow, hopefully this was helpful. We'll see you next time.